If you think America's housing crisis is just high prices, you're watching the wrong screen. The real warning sign is simpler and more brutal. In much of the United States, a basic necessity is no longer priced like shelter. It's priced like a financial product. And when shelter starts behaving like an asset class, the middle class doesn't just struggle, it gets structurally locked out. Here's the one-line truth nobody wants to say out loud. This isn't a normal market. It's a filter. A filter that decides who gets stability and who gets a lifetime subscription to rent. This week, a Fox Business discussion put the spotlight on two familiar villains: Wall Street investors buying single-family homes and immigration increasing demand. But that framing is convenient, not complete. It turns a structural crisis into a blame story. And blame stories are easy to sell because they're emotionally satisfying. The problem is, they're usually missing the mechanics. So, let's talk mechanics. Because when you understand the machinery, you understand why fixes keep failing and why the crisis keeps spreading, even when headlines claim inflation is cooling. Start with the number that should stop everyone in their tracks. Roughly 3 out of 4 homes listed for sale are unaffordable for a typical median-income household. Think about what that means in real life. It means a family can do everything right, work full-time, save, avoid reckless spending, and still look at the listings and realize the math doesn't work. Not in Manhattan, not in Beverly Hills, in normal America. And that is the point. The crisis is no longer just a coastal story. It's a nationwide affordability regime. Now, before we even touch politics, we need to separate two things the media constantly mixes together: the price of housing and the cost of owning housing. Those are not the same. The price is what you pay at closing. The cost is what you carry every month afterward. Mortgage payment, insurance, property taxes, repairs, utilities, HOA fees, and sometimes special assessments. Even people who bought years ago can feel squeezed because the ownership stack rises as values rise. When assessed values climb, property taxes climb. When risks rise, insurance rises. And suddenly, a paid-off home doesn't feel so safe. It feels like a bill that keeps growing. That's a key detail many segments skip because it complicates the narrative. A housing crisis isn't only young renters can't buy. It becomes long-time homeowners are getting pressured too. And when both renters and owners feel stress, politics gets volatile fast. Now let's go to the first villain: institutional investors buying single-family homes. A lot of Americans hate this for a reason that is completely rational. They don't just feel outbid, they feel outmatched. A professional buyer doesn't need to love the house. They need the numbers to work. They show up with speed, with standardized processes, with fewer contingencies, and often with stronger financing. Meanwhile, the first-time buyer is waiting on underwriting, worrying about appraisals, and trying to protect their down payment like it's the last lifeboat. Here's a simple example. Imagine 2 offers on the same home. A family offers asking price, needs a mortgage, and asks for a reasonable inspection. An investor offers slightly above asking, waives contingencies, and closes quickly. In a seller's market, the investor wins more often than not. That is not a moral argument. That is a structural outcome. But here's the nuance that almost never makes the viral clips. Investors don't have to dominate nationally to cause serious pain locally. Housing is not one national market. It's thousands of local markets. In some zip codes, investor concentration can spike, and the comps reset upward. That's how a neighborhood changes. Not because every home is purchased by a corporation, but because enough homes are purchased quickly, repeatedly, and with a higher tolerance for price that the floor rises. This is why people say, "I can't compete with Wall Street." They're not describing a national statistic, they're describing an experience. And then comes the hidden second-order effect. When purchase prices rise, assessed values rise. When assessed values rise, property taxes rise. So even families who have lived in a neighborhood for a decade can feel a new kind of pressure they never budgeted for. That's when housing stops being a foundation and starts feeling like a treadmill. Now here's the part that matters most. Investors did not create the shortage. They monetized it. Investors move toward markets where scarcity is durable and demand is predictable. If you want fewer investors in housing, you don't just scold them. You remove the scarcity premium that makes the strategy so attractive. And that brings us to the real engine of this crisis: supply. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States spent years underbuilding housing relative to needs. But underbuilding makes it sound like an accident. In many places, it wasn't. It was policy. It was zoning rules that limited density. It was neighborhood veto points that turned every new project into a political war. It was permitting processes that stretched for months, then years. It was lawsuits, delays, fees, and compliance costs that stacked up until only luxury units penciled out. It was a system that made building modest housing harder than building expensive housing. That's why you keep hearing about missing middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small apartment buildings, accessory units, gentle density that fits into neighborhoods without skyscrapers. This is the ladder that used to exist between renting and buying. In many cities, that ladder has been chopped off. So the market does what markets do. When supply can't respond and demand keeps pressing, prices rise, rents rise, and the winners are the people who already own assets. The losers are the people who are trying to enter. Pattern interrupt. Scarcity is not a natural disaster. It's a design. Now the segment pivots to the second villain: immigration. The claim is straightforward. Immigration increases demand, which strains a market already under pressure, pricing out American families, especially at the lower end. Let's be serious. Demand matters. Adding people to a system that isn't building enough units will intensify competition. That is basic arithmetic. But here's what gets lost when this turns into a political weapon. Demand shocks become crises only when supply is rigid. Think of it like traffic. If a city keeps building roads and improving transit, more drivers don't automatically cause a permanent gridlock. But if a city freezes road expansion and bans transit improvements, then every new driver feels like the cause of congestion. The cause isn't the driver. The cause is a system that can't adapt. Housing works the same way. If you have a flexible building system, demand increases can be absorbed. If you have a frozen system, demand increases become explosive. That's why blame immigration is emotionally powerful and politically convenient. It focuses attention on a variable the federal government can control, while ignoring the deeper structural bottlenecks controlled by local rules. Here's a second under-discussed layer. Not all demand is equal. What breaks markets is demand at the margin, people competing for the same tier of housing. In many metros, the fiercest battle isn't for luxury condos. It's for workforce rentals and starter homes. Those are precisely the segments most constrained by missing middle rules and slow approvals. So what does this mean for everyday life in the short term? It means the cost of stability is rising faster than the ability to pay for it. It means longer commutes, smaller living spaces, delayed homeownership, delayed marriage, delayed kids, and a growing sense that the American path is turning into a maze. This is not just a housing story. It's a mobility story. When you can't afford to live near opportunity, opportunity becomes less real. When you can't buy into a stable community, stability becomes a privilege. Now let's address the policy talk, because this is where the country keeps getting stuck. The guest offered the right supply-side menu: build more homes, reduce red tape, reform zoning, cut permitting delays, lower development costs. That is the core. But here's the truth that scares politicians. The U.S. housing crisis is not only an economic problem, it's a governance problem. Why? Because many of the most important levers are local. Federal officials can make speeches. State governments can pass broad reforms. But the actual pipeline, what gets approved, where, how fast, and at what density, often lives in city councils, planning boards, and local permitting offices. And local politics has a built-in conflict. The benefits of housing construction are broad and delayed. Future renters, future buyers, future workers. The perceived costs are local and immediate. Construction disruption, traffic fears, school crowding, and the anxiety that property values might stop rising. So the present blocks the future. Pattern interrupt. Blame is easy. Permitting reform is hard. Now, what about interest rates? You'll hear it a lot. Lower rates will fix this. Lower rates can help builders finance projects and can lower monthly payments, but they can also raise prices if supply remains constrained because cheaper money increases buying power. If you cut rates without adding supply, you can end up inflating the very asset you're trying to make affordable. That is the trap. The guest mentioned assumable mortgages, letting buyers take over the seller's existing low-rate mortgage. It's an interesting idea because it addresses a real lock-in problem. Millions of homeowners are sitting on ultra-low rates and don't want to sell into higher-rate reality. More mobility could help inventory. But here's the reality check. Assumable mortgages don't erase the affordability gap if prices remain high. Even if you inherit a low rate, you still have to cover the seller's equity. If a home is far above what the median household can afford, the rate alone doesn't fix the entry problem. It may help at the margins. It isn't a cure. So what is the real diagnosis? America has been running a quiet experiment for decades. Restrict housing supply while treating housing as the central wealth engine of the middle class. That creates an incentive to preserve scarcity because scarcity protects asset values. And when scarcity protects asset values, anyone trying to increase supply becomes a political enemy of the existing owner class. That's how you end up with a system where the country needs more housing. But many local governments behave as if adding housing is a threat. This is why the crisis keeps spreading. Not because one administration did one thing, not because one group arrived, not because one company bought a few neighborhoods. It spreads because the underlying structure rewards scarcity and punishes abundance. Now, let's talk about what the media often avoids: the distributional consequences. When housing turns into an asset class machine, the gains are not evenly shared. Homeowners with equity benefit from appreciation. Investors benefit from rent streams and asset inflation. Local governments benefit from rising tax bases. Meanwhile, renters face rising costs and less stability. First-time buyers face a moving target. Young adults face delayed wealth building. And the middle class experiences a new kind of insecurity. Not unemployment insecurity, but stability insecurity. When stability becomes expensive, everything becomes political. That's why you're seeing housing move from a lifestyle issue into a core election issue. It's not just about shelter. It's about whether the system still offers a pathway to a better tomorrow. So what should viewers take away from that Fox segment? Takeaway number 1, the Wall Street versus immigration debate is not the real fight. The real fight is whether America is willing to change the rules that keep housing scarce. Takeaway number 2, investor activity matters, especially locally, but it's amplified by scarcity. Reduce the scarcity, and you reduce the investor edge. Takeaway number 3, affordability isn't only price, it's the full cost stack. Taxes, insurance, fees, repairs, rising in a way that squeezes both renters and owners. Takeaway number 4, this is a governance crisis. National leaders can't solve a problem controlled by thousands of local veto points unless they change incentives and rules. And here's the takeaway that should make everyone uncomfortable. You can't have all 4 of these at once. Cheap housing, perfect neighborhood stasis, zero new density, and endlessly rising property values. A society has to choose. If America chooses scarcity, it will choose stratification. It will choose a future where ownership is increasingly inherited, not earned. Where geography determines destiny. Where the middle class exists, but with thinner margins and higher anxiety. If America chooses abundance through smarter zoning, faster permitting, and real investment in workforce housing, it can rebuild the latter. Not overnight, not with a slogan, but with policy that matches the scale of the crisis. So here's my final question for you, because it tells me how you see the country. Is America's housing crisis primarily a supply problem created by local rules, or is it mainly driven by investors and immigration? And what policy would you change first if you had the power? No noise, no spin, just analysis.